When my stepsister Brianna stood up at the front of the reception hall and asked everyone to settle in for a few words about my father, I assumed she was finally going to say something kind about the man who raised her for 15 years. Instead, she looked directly at my mother, seated quietly in the second row because her front row seat had mysteriously disappeared an hour earlier, and said, "I just want to acknowledge the people who were truly part of Robert's life these past years, since some faces here today are really just old history." She smiled as she said it. What she didn't know was that folded inside my purse was a document dated 4 months before my father's death, one that would prove exactly who he considered family, and one that would end her carefully built version of events before the coffee was even poured. My name is Amanda Coleman. I'm 35, a hospice social worker, and for the past 11 days I have been grieving my father, Robert, while simultaneously watching my stepsister try to rewrite the last 20 years of our family's history in real time. My parents divorced when I was 12, an amicable split by most standards, though nothing about divorce ever feels amicable to a child living through it. My mother, Linda, never remarried. She spent those years building a small accounting practice from nothing, working long hours so she could still show up to every recital, every graduation, every milestone that mattered to me. My father remarried 6 years after the divorce to a woman named Sharon, who brought her own daughter, Brianna, into the family. For years, things were civil enough. My father made a genuine effort to stay close with my mother, especially once grandchildren entered the picture. He believed, firmly and often out loud, that divorce didn't have to mean erasing someone from a family's life if they had once been good to you. Brianna never shared that belief. From the moment Sharon and my father married, Brianna treated my mother's continued presence in our lives as an inconvenience to be managed, then slowly, over the years, as a threat to be eliminated entirely. She was especially focused on anything involving money or inheritance, constantly positioning herself as my father's real support system in his later years, despite living 3 states away and visiting maybe twice annually. I saw my father almost every single week for the last decade of his life. I drove him to doctor's appointments. I sat with him during his cancer treatments the final 8 months. My mother, despite their divorce, called him every Sunday without fail, a habit neither of them ever fully let go of, one that Brianna found deeply threatening for reasons I wouldn't fully understand until the day of the funeral. For months before my father passed, during one of our quiet Sunday afternoons at his house while he was between chemotherapy sessions, he asked me to help him update some paperwork. He'd been meaning to do it for years, he said, but kept putting it off. Together, we sat at his kitchen table while he dictated changes to his will, changes his longtime attorney formalized the following week. He wanted to make sure Linda, my mother, was named as the beneficiary of a life insurance policy he'd quietly maintained since their divorce, one worth $180,000. A policy, he said, existed specifically because he never stopped feeling responsible for making sure she was taken care of, given everything she'd sacrificed raising me largely on her own income during my teenage years. He also updated the will itself to explicitly state that Linda should be treated as family at any future services or gatherings, a strange, specific clause my father insisted on adding after admitting, quietly, that he worried about how Brianna and Sharon might behave once he was gone. I didn't understand the weight of that worry until 11 days ago, when he passed peacefully in his sleep. The funeral itself went smoothly. Brianna and Sharon handled most of the arrangements, which I didn't mind. Grief leaves little energy for logistics. But the moment the reception began at the hotel banquet room afterward, I noticed the front row of reserved seating, the row meant for immediate family during the memorial slideshow, had exactly 5 chairs instead of 6. My mother's name, which had been included on the seating chart I'd seen the night before, was missing entirely. I found Brianna near the catering table, arranging place cards with the same controlled precision she brings to everything. Brianna, my mom's seat is missing from the front row. She barely looked up. I had to adjust things this morning. We only had so much room, and, honestly, Amanda, it felt a little strange having her up there with Sharon, given the circumstances. I'm sure she'll understand. My mother, seated a few feet away, had clearly heard every word, though as always, she said nothing, simply lowering her eyes to the program in her lap. I felt something tighten in my chest, the particular kind of anger that comes from watching someone quietly humiliate a grieving woman on the worst day of her life. Brianna, my parents were married for 15 years. She raised me. Dad called her every single Sunday for the last decade. She belongs in that row. Brianna's expression cooled instantly. She belongs wherever Sharon is comfortable putting her honestly. This is Sharon's day to say goodbye to her husband, not a reunion for Robert's ex-wife. I wanted to argue further, but the memorial slideshow was starting, and creating a scene before the actual service felt wrong, even to me. I let it go for the moment, promising myself I'd address it properly afterward. That decision to wait is exactly what gave Brianna the opening to escalate things at the reception instead. After the service, as guests gathered in the reception hall for coffee and quiet conversation, Brianna stood at the front of the room and asked for everyone's attention, claiming she wanted to share a few final words about my father. I assumed, hopefully, that grief had softened her enough to say something gracious. Instead, she delivered her line, looking directly at my mother seated in the second row. I just want to acknowledge the people who were truly part of Robert's life these past years, since some faces here today are really just old history. A few of Sharon's friends chuckled softly, clearly unaware of the specific cruelty behind the comment. My mother sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, dignity intact even as her face reddened slightly. I stood up before I'd fully decided to. Actually, Brianna, since we're clarifying who is truly part of Dad's life, I think there's something everyone should hear. Brianna's smile tightened. Amanda, this really isn't the time. I think it's exactly the time, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor building underneath it, since you just told a room full of people that my mother, who was married to Dad for 15 years and spoke to him every single Sunday for the past decade, is just old history. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded document, the will's family clause my father had specifically dictated 4 months earlier. This is from Dad's updated will, finalized in June, for months before he passed. In his own words, dictated to his attorney and witnessed properly, he wrote that Linda Coleman should be treated as family at any services or gatherings held in his memory, because, in his words, divorce ended a marriage, not a family. Gasps rippled quietly through the room. Sharon's face flushed with visible discomfort, though she said nothing, staring instead at her folded hands. Brianna's composure cracked slightly. That clause doesn't mean anything legally, Amanda. It's just sentimental language. Maybe, I said. But this next part isn't sentimental at all. I pulled out the second document, the insurance beneficiary confirmation I'd received just 2 days earlier from the policy administrator. Dad also maintained a life insurance policy worth $180,000, quietly, for the past 15 years, specifically naming Mom as the beneficiary. He updated the paperwork 4 months ago to make sure it stayed that way, because he wanted her taken care of, especially after everything she sacrificed raising me largely alone during my teenage years. The room went completely silent. Sharon's head snapped up, staring at Brianna with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between shock and suspicion. Brianna, Sharon said slowly, did you know about this policy? Brianna hesitated a beat too long. I might have seen paperwork about it once, but I assumed it had lapsed years ago, or that it had been changed. You told me last month, Sharon said, her voice rising, that there was no separate policy, that everything was already accounted for in the estate. I watched something shift across the room as guests began quietly putting pieces together, whispers spreading from table to table. My mother, still seated, finally spoke, her voice calm but clear enough to carry. I never asked for any of this. Robert wanted it this way. That's all that ever mattered to me. I walked over, helped her stand, and guided her to the empty chair in the front row, the 6th chair that had mysteriously reappeared once catering staff, overhearing the commotion, quietly restored the original seating arrangement without anyone needing to ask. 6 weeks have passed since that reception. The insurance claim was processed without complication once the policy documentation was formally reviewed, confirming what my father had arranged months before his death. My mother used part of the funds to finally pay off her small business loan, something she'd been quietly struggling under for years, though she never once mentioned it to me out of pride. Sharon and Brianna's relationship, from what I understand through mutual family friends, has grown noticeably strained since that day, particularly once it came out during a follow-up conversation with the estate attorney that Brianna had, in fact, known about the insurance policy for months and had specifically advised Sharon it no longer existed, apparently hoping the funds would default into the general estate instead, an estate Brianna stood to benefit from far more directly. Whether that constitutes something Sharon eventually pursues legally isn't something I involve myself in. My focus has been my mother, who now speaks about my father's memory with a peace I hadn't seen in her in years, no longer carrying the quiet weight of being treated as an afterthought in a family she helped build for 15 years. I learned, standing in that reception hall holding 2 pieces of paper, that grief has a way of revealing exactly who people really are, and that sometimes honoring someone's memory means refusing to let their final wishes be quietly buried along with them.